The summer air hung heavy with the scent of roasted meat and money. The kind of scent that only ever lingered at gatherings where people came to show off more than to celebrate. My father's estate stood like a monument to pride, all glass walls and trimmed hedges. A mansion built to prove a point rather than to feel like home. Every inch of marble inside was polished so clean that even your reflection seemed to hesitate before stepping on it. The family party that evening wasn't just another dinner. It was a statement. My stepmother, Layla, had been planning it for weeks, seating charts, catering menus, the floral arrangements that matched the shade of her diamond earrings. She said it was a family reunion, but it was really a display, a chance to remind everyone that she was now the lady of the house. From the start, something felt off. There were whispers, tight smiles, and eyes that lingered longer than politeness allowed. Old family members who once used to greet me warmly now looked at me like I was a guest who'd overstayed his welcome. Lila's influence had spread quietly over the years, shaping conversations, rewriting loyalties, and turning the mansion into her personal stage. As I stood near the long dining table, I could feel her watching me. Her eyes carried the same cold authority that had built invisible walls around my father. The once vibrant man, the man who taught me to dream, now spoke only in measured tones, as if every word had to pass through her approval. The dining table gleamed under golden light. Plates of grilled lamb, buttered rice, and freshly baked bread filled the air with a false sense of warmth. Everyone had their seat, the hierarchy clear, the arrangement deliberate. I wasn't at the far end, but I wasn't near my father either. A reminder, perhaps, of where I stood now in this family. When dinner began, Layla floated around like a hostess from a dream, laughing, complimenting, serving plates herself, earning praise from the guests. And then, when she reached me, her smile faltered just enough for me to notice. She placed a small plate in front of me, 2 pieces of dry, stale bread, no butter. No sides. It wasn't an accident, it was a message. The room filled with laughter and music, but around me, it was silence. My plate stood out against the richness around it, plain, bare, humiliating. For a second, I thought maybe my father would notice, maybe he'd see what she had done. But his glass was full, his laughter louder than the truth sitting in front of me. In that moment, I realized something fundamental. This house wasn't mine anymore. My father might have built it, but she owned it. Every wall, every whisper, every look of approval that passed around the table. She had rewritten the meaning of family in this house, and I was no longer a part of it. The bread felt like paper in my mouth, dry, tasteless, suffocating. But I forced myself to eat it, every crumb, every brittle edge. Not because I was hungry, but because I knew she was watching. And I wanted her to see that humiliation didn't break me. It only hardened me. After dinner, when everyone moved to the patio for music and speeches, I lingered behind. I watched the servants clear the plates, their eyes darting nervously between me and the rest of the family. They had seen it too, the small cruelty, the deliberate act. But in this house, silence was safer than sympathy. That night, as the guests cheered and glasses clinked, I looked at my father. He stood beside her, his arm around her waist, smiling at something she said. He looked proud of her, proud of what he thought was his perfect family, but I saw something else. The emptiness in his eyes. The subtle discomfort of a man who had forgotten what real family warmth felt like. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I didn't know it yet, but that dry bread was going to become the spark that reignited everything, the truth, the loyalty, and the love my father had forgotten. Layla had built a fortress of manipulation around him, but she had underestimated one thing, the quiet determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. The next morning, the mansion looked calm, almost innocent. But inside, my thoughts had started to rearrange themselves like puzzle pieces falling into place. I wasn't angry anymore, not the kind of anger that burns out quickly. This was colder, sharper, patient. I began to watch. Every word, every movement, every person who came in and out of that house. I noticed how Layla managed the accounts, how she handled the staff, how she controlled my father's meetings. I saw the subtle changes, names disappearing from his contact list, properties sold quietly, and the way certain documents never reached his desk. This wasn't just a family feud, it was a quiet takeover. She wasn't just humiliating me. She was isolating him. Slowly, systematically, until one day he'd wake up surrounded only by people who owed their loyalty to her. And I couldn't let that happen. The days that followed turned into a study of silence. I learned to smile when I wanted to scream, to nod when I wanted to question, to let her believe that I had accepted my place. All the while, I was piecing together something far more powerful than confrontation, the truth. I began with the smallest things, old receipts, property records, handwritten notes my father once kept in his study. The housekeeper, an old woman who had been there long before Layla, started to notice my quiet persistence. One evening, she slipped me a folder from the archives, something Layla had ordered destroyed months ago. Inside were property transfer papers, half completed, unsigned, but damning enough to reveal intent. My father's signature line was blank, but the witness line already carried one name, Lila's cousin. It was the beginning of a web. And in that moment, I understood that my revenge wasn't going to be about shouting or confrontation. It was going to be about revelation. About reminding my father what family really meant. Loyalty, honesty, and love that didn't come with contracts and signatures. I stayed up that night under the dim glow of my desk lamp, tracing every name, every address, every transaction. It was slow, painful work, but it gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. Weeks passed, and the household carried on as usual. Layla hosted lunches, charity dinners, and brunches with socialites who pretended to adore her. My father continued to attend meetings, his health declining subtly under the weight of stress and manipulation. But I was ready now. By the time her next grand event came around, another family gathering, I had a plan. It wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be public. It would be deliberate. Because I didn't just want to expose her. I wanted to remind my father what real family tasted like, not dry bread and cold smiles, but truth and loyalty. And as the first guests arrived that evening, I knew exactly where to start. Morning light crept through the tall curtains of the mansion, soft and golden, but nothing about that house ever felt truly warm anymore. Every corner held secrets wrapped in silk. The chandeliers sparkled as if mocking the quiet tension that lived beneath them. Lila's voice floated faintly from the garden, giving instructions to the event planner, her tone sharp yet coated with the sweetness of control. That day marked the second family gathering of the summer, another excuse to parade perfection before people who already knew it was a show. I watched her from the study window. She moved with a precision that belonged to someone who believed she owned the world. Her words turned men into workers and workers into shadows. She had built her kingdom out of influence and pretense, and my father was its silent king, a man wearing a crown he no longer controlled. He had changed. Once, he would greet the sunrise with ambition, checking reports, meeting partners, walking through his lands with pride. But now his energy belonged elsewhere, to her events, her charities, her endless circle of admiration. His laughter sounded hollow, rehearsed. I sometimes wondered if he realized how much of himself he had lost since she arrived. That morning, as I prepared for the evening's gathering, I found myself staring at an old family portrait. My mother's face, calm, kind, gentle, looked back at me through time. She had passed away long before Layla came, leaving a silence that used to feel sacred. But Layla had filled it with noise, polished, artificial, suffocating noise. The portrait reminded me why I was doing this. The humiliation at the dinner wasn't just about me. It was about what she had turned our family into, an arrangement of appearances. And it was time to unmake it. Over the past weeks, I had pieced together the puzzle, the documents, the transfers, the silent replacements of trusted people. One name stood out more than others, Rashid Mirza, my father's former financial advisor. Fired without explanation 2 years ago, replaced by someone handpicked by Layla. Rashid had managed most of my father's properties, including the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, the one my mother loved. I called him quietly, meeting him at a small cafe where no one from our world would appear. He looked older, worn out, but his eyes lit up when I mentioned my father's name. He spoke cautiously, almost apologetically, but what he revealed confirmed my suspicions. Several estates had been consolidated, meaning sold and merged into new trusts. Trusts that my father had no active oversight on. The paperwork bore his printed name, but not his true signature. When I asked who orchestrated it, Rashid didn't answer directly. He only said, some people build empires with money. Others build them with relationships. And then he handed me a file he had kept for his own protection. Inside were transaction histories, correspondence copies, and most importantly, the preliminary drafts of the new will that my father had unknowingly signed. The signatures were authentic, my father's, yes, but the content had been modified after he signed. Assets once promised to me and to family charities were redirected to joint family holdings, which effectively meant to her, it wasn't theft in the traditional sense. It was elegant, legal manipulation. The kind that leaves no trace except for a paper trail too complex for ordinary eyes. I walked back to the mansion with that file hidden inside my jacket, the weight of it both heavy and satisfying. The sun was setting by the time I reached the gates. Workers moved like ants across the driveway, carrying flowers, silver trays, and banners with my father's name, though the credit belonged to her. Inside, the air was cool, perfumed, and false. Lila's presence was everywhere, her taste, her scent, her perfection. I passed by her vanity table, where an open envelope lay half hidden beneath a jewelry box. My curiosity betrayed me. I picked it up. It was addressed to her from an attorney's office. The first line confirmed what I already feared. She was initiating a secondary transfer of ownership for the downtown properties, the last remaining ones tied to my mother's estate. She wasn't done yet. She was accelerating. That night, as guests filled the mansion, I stayed in the background, observing. My father looked tired, his posture a little more bent than before. He greeted everyone warmly, but his gaze often drifted toward her, as though seeking reassurance rather than affection. He didn't notice how she managed every detail, which wine was poured, which compliments reached his ear, which topics were silenced before they began. I watched her move through the crowd like a conductor leading a silent orchestra. She laughed in perfect intervals, smiled with practiced grace, and yet, beneath it all, her eyes scanned constantly, for weakness, for resistance, for control. When the guests toasted to family success, I stayed silent. My eyes were on her, and she knew it. For the briefest second, her smile faltered. Just slightly, enough to tell me she still remembered what she had done at that first dinner, enough to know that I hadn't forgotten. After midnight, the mansion grew quieter. The guests had left. The music had faded. My father retired early, exhausted. Layla remained awake, walking through the dim hallways, rearranging flower vases, as if control could soothe her restlessness. I waited until the house fell into silence, then slipped into my father's study. I had learned the rhythm of that house, which floors creaked, which doors locked silently. I opened his filing cabinet, removed the folder marked Trusts, and laid Rashid's file beside it. The differences were subtle but devastating. The real documents proved that assets once under my father's direct ownership were now bound to shell companies operated by her family abroad. Each property, each asset, represented not just money but legacy, the roots of our name. And she had been cutting them away piece by piece. I copied everything, scanned it quietly, and replaced the originals. Then I placed one page, the most revealing one, inside a separate envelope marked with my father's initials. I left it on his desk, positioned perfectly so he'd see it first in the morning. I didn't expect him to believe me instantly. Years of manipulation don't crumble overnight. But truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. Before leaving the study, I paused. The air felt heavy, almost charged. I could hear her faint footsteps upstairs, pacing, perhaps sensing something she couldn't name. For the first time, I felt not fear, but calm, the calm of someone who knows what must be done. The next morning, I woke to a silence thicker than usual. The housekeeper avoided my eyes. My father didn't come down for breakfast. Lila's voice was unusually sharp, her tone brittle. Something has shifted. By noon, the study door remained closed. When it finally opened, my father emerged, holding the envelope I had left. His expression was unreadable. He walked past me without a word, his step steady, his silence louder than any accusation. Layla followed him, pretending calm, asking routine questions. But her eyes betrayed panic. She knew something had been exposed. The rest of the day unfolded in strange quiet. No confrontation, no raised voices. Just stillness. The kind that precedes a storm. That evening, I sat by the terrace, watching the sunset bleed across the horizon. My father's silhouette appeared by the railing. For a long moment, we didn't speak. He didn't need to ask how I found the documents. He simply said, "Some truths can't stay buried." His voice carried both pain and recognition, the first crack in her fortress. And yet, I knew this was only the beginning. The truth had been planted, but lies don't die easily. Later that night, I overheard her speaking on the phone, her words hushed and furious. "We may need to move the rest faster," she whispered. "He's beginning to question things." That confirmed everything. She was preparing for retreat, transferring what she could before exposure turned into ruin. I realized then that exposing her wasn't enough. I had to reclaim what was stolen, not through vengeance but through strategy. I had to remind my father that family isn't built on appearances or signatures, but on trust, the kind she had erased from his life. So I began the second phase, a quieter, more dangerous one. I reached out to those she had replaced. The old lawyer, the original caretaker, the dismissed accountant. Each of them carried fragments of a story that, when assembled, painted a complete picture of deception. I documented everything. Dates, transfers, emails, voice messages. I created a timeline of betrayal, detailed enough to withstand any denial. But I also knew she was watching. Her eyes followed me wherever I went. Her kindness grew exaggerated, her words more deliberate. She suspected me now. That week, she invited me to dinner again, just the three of us. The table was set elegantly, every detail perfect. She smiled as she served the food, her hands steady, her eyes testing. The bread this time was fresh, soft, and warm. A performance of reconciliation, but I saw through it. I accepted the plate with quiet politeness, knowing exactly what this gesture meant. She wasn't offering peace, she was reasserting control. My father ate slowly, distracted, occasionally glancing between us. The silence that filled the room was suffocating, the kind that only exists when truth lingers unspoken between three people. When dinner ended, she leaned back in her chair, her voice smooth as silk. "Family means forgiveness," she said softly. But there was a tremor beneath her words, fear disguised as grace. I met her gaze, calm, unflinching. She understood then that I wasn't going to stop. Later that night, I returned to my room and opened the window. The wind carried the scent of rain, clean, refreshing, inevitable. I realized that everything was about to change. Lila's empire of manipulation had started to crumble, and my father was finally beginning to see the cracks. But she wasn't going to surrender quietly. And as thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, I knew the next storm would come from within these very walls. Morning came quietly, yet as something in the air felt heavier, like the silence before a landslide. The mansion looked the same on the surface, but every wall seemed to hum with tension. Even the servants whispered more softly, moving quickly through hallways, as though afraid to disturb something fragile. My father's demeanor had changed since finding those papers. The certainty that once carried him, the calm authority that defined him, was now replaced by quiet calculation. He spoke less, observed more. Every time Layla entered a room, his eyes followed her, not in admiration anymore, but in assessment. She noticed it too, though she pretended not to. Her laughter became louder, her compliments more exaggerated, her control tighter. I had seen this pattern before, not in our house, but in the business world my father once ruled. When power begins to slip, the desperate always double their grip. Over the next few days, subtle cracks began to appear. The accountant resigned suddenly. The housekeeper was dismissed without warning. My father's schedule, once packed with meetings, now included private time in his study. Long, uninterrupted hours behind closed doors. I didn't know what he was doing inside, but I suspected he was digging into the same pile of truths I had uncovered. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, I found him standing alone by the balcony overlooking the western gardens. His shoulders were slightly bent, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "There are things a man should never delegate," he said quietly. "Trust, family legacy." It was the first time in years he had used that tone. Not the polished civility he reserved for social gatherings, but the voice of a man remembering who he used to be. That night, I heard raised voices through the walls, hers sharp and defensive, his low but firm. The words were muffled, but the rhythm was clear. She was cornered. He had started asking the right questions. The next morning, the tension thickened. Lila didn't come down for breakfast. The staff avoided eye contact. My father ate alone, his jaw tight, his silence deliberate. When he finally left the table, he said only one thing to me. She tried to cover her tracks. I already knew she would. Later that afternoon, I received an email, anonymous, brief, with no subject line. The attached file contained scanned documents, including wire transfers to an offshore account. The sender's name was hidden, but I recognized the formatting. It was Rashid, the old advisor, his final act of loyalty. The transfers were recent, some even dated after my father's discovery. She was still moving money, quietly, hoping to extract whatever she could before the truth caught up. I printed everything, organized it, and waited. That evening, my father called a family dinner. It was unusual. No guests, no planners, no photographers. Just the three of us again. The table looked smaller that night, though nothing in its size had changed. Layla arrived dressed in white, her expression composed but cold. Her eyes flickered briefly toward my father, searching for signs of weakness. But he gave her none. He carved his meal slowly, methodically, the clink of silverware the only sound in the room. Halfway through, he finally spoke. "Lala," he said, his tone calm. "I went through the accounts today." Her fork froze midair. Then she smiled, that perfect polished smile that had fooled half the city. "Oh? I hope everything's in order." He nodded once, almost kindly. "It is now." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. I didn't look up, but I could feel the heat between them. A war fought through stillness. After dinner, she disappeared upstairs. My father lingered in the study again, the door half closed. When I passed by, I caught sight of stacks of papers on his desk, property files, bank ledgers, correspondence archives. He was preparing something, quietly, carefully. By midnight, the house was dark except for the faint light from his study. I stayed awake, half expecting to hear another argument. Instead, I heard movement, hurried footsteps in the hallway, then the faint creak of the back door. I moved silently toward the sound. Through the window, I saw her, Layla, stepping into a waiting car parked behind the hedges. She carried a small leather briefcase. The car's headlights flashed once, then disappeared into the darkness. She wasn't retreating. She was repositioning. The next day, rumors began to circulate. Old associates called, asking my father strange questions about liquidation plans and asset transfers. Someone, likely her, had started spreading misinformation to create confusion, to make it look like he was the one losing control. I realized then that she wasn't just fighting to keep her power. She was rewriting the narrative itself. She wanted to turn him into the villain of his own story, the aging patriarch losing grip, while she appeared as the devoted wife protecting what's left. But she had underestimated how far I was willing to go. I began meeting quietly with people who still respected my father, the old lawyer, the property registrar, even one of the bank managers who had once attended our family dinners. I didn't tell them everything, just enough to plant doubt about the legitimacy of certain transactions. Doubt is a powerful weapon. It spreads faster than truth and lasts longer than lies. Within a week, the first reversal hit. The downtown commercial property, the one she had been trying to transfer, was frozen pending investigation. The offshore account flagged for irregular activity. The walls of her empire began to shake. That evening, she confronted me directly for the first time. It was in the corridor near the staircase, her eyes gleaming under the chandelier light. Her smile was gone now, replaced by something raw and sharp. "You think you've won," she said softly. "But you don't understand how this world works." Her voice was almost gentle, but her eyes burned with fury. She stepped closer, lowering her tone. "Your father built his fortune on control. I simply learned from him. You're fighting a war that's already over." Then she turned and walked away, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and the echo of her arrogance. But she was wrong. The war wasn't over. It had only just shifted battlegrounds. That night, my father called me into the study. On his desk lay 2 envelopes. One was addressed to the family lawyer. The other bore my name. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. "Tomorrow, I'm transferring management of the family trust back to its rightful owner," he said quietly. For a second, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't about money. It was about recognition, about trust restored. "She won't take it lightly," I said. He gave a faint smile. "I don't expect her to." The next morning began like any other, sunlight spilling through curtains, the sound of workers trimming the garden. But beneath the calm surface, everything had changed. My father met with the lawyer privately. Documents were signed, sealed, witnessed. The legal transition was set in motion. Layla must have sensed it, because by noon, her tone turned brittle again. She ordered the staff around, demanded updates from the accountant, checked the mail twice. Paranoia had begun to replace confidence, and then the blow landed. The lawyer, following proper protocol, sent her an official notice, informing her that all joint trust activities would be suspended pending review. Her reaction was volcanic. By evening, her voice echoed through the mansion, sharp and panicked. The perfect composure she'd maintained for years shattered in a single afternoon. She accused, denied, threatened, a storm of emotion she could no longer disguise. My father didn't respond. He sat quietly in his chair, letting her words dissolve into the air. When she finally stormed out, slamming the door behind her, the silence that followed felt like the first breath after drowning. But peace doesn't return easily. That night, as the house slept, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. People like her don't vanish quietly. They retreat, they plan, and they strike again. I checked the locks, the gates, even the garage. Everything seemed fine, until I noticed a small detail. The safe in my father's study was slightly open. Inside, the documents he had signed that morning were gone. Panic rose in my chest. I ran to his room. He was asleep, unaware. I checked the hallway, empty. I called the night guard, no response. And then I saw it. The back door ajar, curtains fluttering from the wind. She had left again. But this time, she hadn't taken jewelry or cash. She had taken the truth, the very documents that restored everything we had fought for. I stood there, staring into the dark garden beyond the door, feeling the weight of what had just begun again. The house around me seemed to breathe, as if mocking the illusion of victory. She was out there now, desperate, dangerous, and armed with leverage. The foundation was cracking faster than I had imagined. And if I didn't act soon, everything, legacy, property, family, would collapse into her version of the story. The dry bread she once served me had been just the beginning. This was no longer about humiliation, it was about survival. And as the wind howled outside, carrying the faint sound of a distant engine disappearing down the road, I knew the next chapter of this war would be fought far beyond the walls of the mansion. The night she disappeared, the house felt hollow. The chandelier still glimmered, the garden still breathed with the faint scent of jasmine. But something in the air had changed, as though the mansion itself had exhaled, tired of pretending. My father's documents were gone, and with them, the fragile balance that had held everything together. Morning came without peace. The staff gathered in whispers, their faces drawn with quiet fear. The head housekeeper stood near the kitchen, clutching her apron, murmuring prayers under her breath. Even the guards avoided meeting my eyes. They all knew something had happened, something that could no longer be hidden. My father woke late, unaware at first. The fatigue of the last few weeks had weighed heavily on him. When he entered the study and saw the safe ajar, the color drained from his face. He didn't say a word, but the silence between us spoke volumes. The trust papers, the property deeds, the signatures gone. Layla had always been clever. Not reckless, not impulsive, calculated. Every move she made had purpose, precision, intent. If she had taken the documents, it meant she had already prepared where to go, whom to meet, and how to use them. By noon, the phone calls began. The family lawyer, his voice uneasy, reported that a copy of the new trust agreement had been submitted to the registrar's office, a version my father hadn't signed in person. Someone had tampered with the dates, forged the witness signatures, and filed it as an official amendment. Her timing was impeccable. The weekend meant the offices were running on skeleton staff, slow and inattentive. The process would slip through unnoticed until the system caught up, by which time she'd already be 2 steps ahead. For the next few hours, my father moved mechanically, calling contacts, demanding clarifications, speaking in short, clipped phrases. I watched the man who had once built empires now battling the collapse of his own home. His authority, though still commanding, carried the weary tremor of someone betrayed too many times. Meanwhile, I started tracing her trail. The security log showed the back gate opened at 1:43 a.m. The car had driven out toward the main highway, eastbound. One of the guards remembered hearing the distant hum of an engine, but assumed it was the gardener's truck. No one questioned it. No one dared. I knew where she was going before anyone said it aloud. Her cousin lived 2 hours away, a man involved in several of the earlier property transfers. His signature had appeared on at least 3 of the forged documents I had uncovered. It made sense she would run to him, not out of affection, but necessity. I left before sunrise the next morning, alone. The drive was long and heavy with dust, the sky overcast with monsoon clouds. Every mile felt like traveling deeper into the heart of deceit. The countryside blurred by fields, half-built developments, forgotten warehouses, the landscape of men who once dreamed of wealth and were swallowed by it. When I reached the outskirts of the town, I parked near an old petrol station. Across the road stood a gated villa, her cousin's property. It wasn't large, but it reeked of sudden money. Imported tiles, mirrored glass, gold-trimmed doors. Her car was parked out front. For hours, I watched. No movement, no noise. Just the occasional flicker of light behind heavy curtains. Around noon, a courier van arrived. A man stepped out, holding a sealed envelope marked Notary Office. He rang the bell, she answered. For a split second, I saw her, poised, unbothered, wearing the same calm expression she used at dinner parties. She took the envelope, signed something, and closed the door. The entire operation was clean, legal, paper-driven. She wasn't hiding from justice, she was hiding inside the system. By evening, rain began to fall, slow at first, then relentless. I stayed in the car, watching her house through the mist. My mind raced through possibilities. Reporting her immediately would take time. Proving intent would take even longer. But if I could intercept what she was filing, if I could get evidence before her version became official, then maybe, just maybe, we could stop the landslide. The following morning, I returned to the registrar's office. The smell of damp paper and bureaucracy filled the air. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as I requested access to the property ledger. The system was slow, ancient, but I found what I needed. A new trust revision had been recorded under my father's name. The date was wrong by 2 weeks, and the witness line carried her cousin's signature again. The supporting documents attached included photocopies of my father's ID and signature, perfect replicas. But one thing stood out. A faint watermark visible only under the office's fluorescent lights. The paper used wasn't standard issue. It was private stock, the same type used by her lawyer, the one she had been secretly meeting for months. That was her mistake. I requested certified copies under the pretense of verification and walked out with evidence. Thin, fragile sheets of paper that carried the weight of everything she had tried to steal. By the time I returned home, the storm had passed, but the damage had deepened. The mansion was quiet again, too quiet. My father sat by the fireplace, holding one of the family photo albums. The images, birthdays, vacations, old smiles, stared back at him like ghosts of a time when love was simple. He looked up as I entered, his eyes tired but resolute. He didn't need to ask where I'd been. He already knew. That night, I placed the copied documents on his desk, the forged ones. He studied them in silence. His hand trembled slightly as he traced the ink. Then he placed them down and said nothing. But I saw something change in his expression, the exhaustion replaced by cold focus. The next morning the lawyer arrived again. Papers were drawn. This time, my father moved quietly, strategically, preparing a full audit of his holdings. Every property, every account, every trust fund. The process was tedious, but it was the only way to expose her manipulation without emotional chaos. Days turned into weeks. The investigation unfolded layer by layer. It was like peeling an onion, every layer revealing another lie beneath it. Hidden accounts in her cousin's name, properties transferred through shell companies, even charitable donations redirected to her personal fund. The scale of it was staggering. But she wasn't finished yet. On the third week, a letter arrived. No return address. Just a wax seal pressed in gold, her mark of vanity. Inside was a single page. You can't erase what's already been signed. No signature, no explanation. Just that one sentence, typed in cold precision. It was both a threat and a reminder. Somewhere, in the vast machinery of legal papers, her version of the truth was still alive, recorded, stamped, acknowledged. My father's health began to waver. The stress carved lines into his face, the kind that no rest could erase. He spent more time in his study, reviewing documents late into the night. I often found him asleep at his desk, glasses askew, pen still in hand. I started managing more of the external affairs, meeting his associates, handling estate matters. Each interaction came with subtle curiosity, quiet whispers about the trouble at home. People loved the spectacle of downfall, even among the rich. But I stayed silent, letting their curiosity starve. Then, one afternoon, an unexpected message came. The registrar's office had frozen 2 of the contested properties, pending verification of ownership. It was a small victory, but it meant the truth was finally catching up. Layla must have heard the news, because that night another message arrived. This time, hand-delivered by courier. Inside was a small velvet pouch containing the original family ring, my late mother's ring, the one she had taken after marrying my father. Alongside it, a note. Family is not inherited. It's chosen. The word stung more than I wanted to admit. They carried both arrogance and finality, as if she were conceding defeat not to me, but to fate. For the next few days, everything went quiet, too quiet. No calls, no letters, no sightings. Her cousin's villa was found empty, the car abandoned near a toll plaza. The lawyer confirmed she hadn't filed anything new. It was as if she had vanished again, leaving behind only echoes, but I knew better. Silence was her weapon too. It meant she was watching, waiting for the next moment to strike. Meanwhile, the audit continued. The numbers began to align, the truth revealing itself in painful clarity. She has siphoned millions, not in cash but in value. Stocks transferred, land undervalued, inheritances diluted. Yet through all of it, one thing remained untouched. The farmhouse my mother had loved, the one property never added to any trust. My father had kept it separate, his quiet act of preservation, maybe even guilt. That farmhouse became our final anchor, the last piece of uncorrupted history. We decided to visit it. The drive there was long and heavy with nostalgia. The air smelled of earth and rain. The fields swayed gently, unbothered by human deceit. When we reached the gate, the sight of the old building brought back memories of childhood, laughter, honesty, simpler times. But as we stepped inside, something felt wrong. The furniture was covered, the lights dim. And on the dining table, like a cruel echo of the past, sat a plate of dry bread. No note, no message. Just silence. The meaning was unmistakable. She had been here. The battle wasn't over. It was simply changing form, from signatures and papers to something far more personal. I looked at my father then, his expression hardened, his eyes distant. The man who had once lost himself in comfort was gone. In his place stood someone rediscovering what truly mattered. As the wind rustled through the old trees outside, the farmhouse seemed to whisper reminders of everything we had lost, and everything we still stood to reclaim. The storm had not passed, it had only found new ground. The farmhouse stood like a living memory, its walls breathing stories from a time when love was simple and truth didn't need to be proven. Dust floated through the streaks of afternoon sunlight, settling on the old family portraits, each frame slightly crooked, each face frozen in happier days. It had been years since my father last set foot there. Yet the moment we stepped inside, I could feel something awaken in him. His silence wasn't just reflection, it was mourning. He ran his fingers along the old banister, tracing the grooves of time. His eyes clouded not with confusion but with remembrance. The house smelled of cedar and rain. Outside, the fields stretched endlessly, green and wet, shimmering with the soft reflection of fading daylight. Inside, everything was still the kind of stillness that feels like it's listening. We moved from room to room slowly, almost reverently. The kitchen, though abandoned, carried faint echoes of laughter. The pantry shelves were empty except for a few glass jars filled with dust and forgotten spices. And then, on the dining table, the dry bread, the same shape, the same cruel reminder. She had been here. She wanted us to know it. That plate sat like a statement, mocking, deliberate, powerful. It wasn't about the bread anymore. It was about memory, ownership, and defiance. My father stared at it for a long time. Then, quietly he sat down in the same chair he used to occupy years ago, before her, before the mansion, before pride turned into pretense. His hand brushed against the old wood, worn smooth by time. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The world beyond these walls continued, but inside time had stopped. I began searching the rooms more carefully, not for valuables, but for meaning. In the study, behind a cabinet warped with age, I found a locked drawer. The key was missing, but a single pull was enough to pry it open. Inside lay a bundle of letters, old, sealed, and yellowed by time. They were my mother's. Each envelope was addressed to my father, written in her delicate handwriting. Some were unopened. I handed them to him silently. He hesitated before opening the first. The paper crinkled softly as he unfolded it. The words were tender, full of affection, full of warning. She had written about the people he was trusting in his business circle, how easily charm could turn into deceit, how ambition could destroy the things one loves most. Her last letter ended with a line that chilled me. If one day this house grows silent, it means love has been replaced by ownership. My father's hands trembled. He folded the letter and pressed it to his chest. The farmhouse had kept its secrets for years, and now it was revealing them one truth at a time. That night, the storm returned. Rain lashed against the windows, wind howled through the cracks, and thunder rolled like distant anger. We stayed by the fire, silent, each lost in our thoughts. At some point, my father spoke not to me, but to the fire. His words were quiet, almost like confession. He spoke of guilt, of blindness, of how easily he had let someone else define the word family. He admitted that Layla hadn't stolen his empire, he had given it away, piece by piece, in exchange for comfort that was never real. And as the fire burned lower, his eyes hardened with resolve. In the morning, I found him already awake. The letters lay open on the table beside him, his notebook filled with new handwriting his own. He was drafting something not legal, not financial, personal. It looked like a statement, a story, maybe even a testament. He was reclaiming his voice. We spent the next few days restoring the farmhouse, dusting, sweeping, repairing. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about grounding ourselves in something real. The house began to feel alive again, its silence turning from grief to purpose. But the peace didn't last. 3 days later, a visitor arrived. A courier, again another envelope, sealed in gold. No message, no sender's name, just a date stamped on the corner. Tomorrow. Inside was a property notice, a claim. Layla had filed a new petition, this time not for ownership, but for division. She was demanding half of everything, including the farmhouse. It was her counterstrike, legal, precise, and ruthless. My father didn't flinch. Let her have what she thinks she can take, he said, his voice calm, almost detached. But I saw the fire in his eyes, the kind that doesn't burn out until the truth is laid bare. That evening, we drove back to the city. The rain had stopped, leaving the roads slick and reflective, like mirrors of all the mistakes we had made. The mansion loomed ahead, dark against the skyline. When we entered, it felt colder than before. The staff greeted us hesitantly. There were no flowers, no music, no life, only silence. Her absence had turned the house into a shell. But she had left her mark. The study was rearranged, files missing, drawers emptied. A new scent lingered in the air, sharp and artificial, like perfume used to cover decay. On the desk lay one final document, unsigned. It was a proposed settlement, a trade. She would withdraw her claims if he publicly admitted negligence and relinquished the family name from future trust titles. It wasn't about money anymore. She wanted reputation, legacy, the power of the story. That night, I walked through the mansion, every room echoing with ghosts of what used to be. The walls, the chandeliers, the marble floors, they all reflected vanity, not love. And yet, beneath all that artifice, there was still something pure, a remnant of what my father had once built for my mother. The next morning, as sunlight poured through the tall windows, my father stood by the main hall. His clothes were simple, his expression steady. He had made a decision. He called the lawyer. Arrangements were made. But this time not for defense, for confrontation. He wanted everything exposed in public record. The forged signatures, the falsified transfers, the manipulation. He wanted the truth documented where it could never be erased again. For years, Layla had ruled through silence. Now, silence would be her undoing. The days that followed felt like the slow turn of justice. Statements were filed, witnesses called, investigators interviewed. The process was long and exhausting, but each piece of evidence chipped away at the empire she had built. Still, she didn't appear, not in court, not in conversation. She remained invisible, her lawyer speaking for her, her presence felt only through paper. Until one evening, just before the final hearing, a black car pulled up outside the mansion. The rain had returned, steady and unending. The car door opened, and she stepped out dressed impeccably, calm, untouched by everything she had done. The same look she gave me that first dinner, the one where she served me dry bread, now met me again. But this time, it was different. I wasn't humiliated anymore. I was prepared. She entered without invitation, walked past the grand staircase, and stopped before the portrait of my mother. She stood there for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then she turned, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor, and disappeared down the hall toward the study. She was walking into the very place where her lies had begun. That night I didn't follow. Some battles, I realized, and not in noise but in quiet reckoning. When I awoke the next morning, she was gone again, but this time for good. Her lawyer sent word later that afternoon. She had withdrawn her claim entirely. No reason given. No explanation. Only silence. In the days that followed, the mansion began to feel lighter. The staff smiled again. The air felt clean. My father spoke more freely, laughed occasionally, even visited the farmhouse once more. The empire she had tried to own was returning to its rightful form, not through power, but through peace. And yet, sometimes, when I walked past the dining room, I still remembered that first dinner. The plate, the bread. The humiliation that had set everything in motion. It had begun as an act of cruelty, but it became the lesson that saved us. Because family isn't what you inherit. It's what you rebuild. Even after betrayal, the house had remembered. And so had we. The mansion no longer felt cursed, yet the calm it carried was not peace. It was the hush before reckoning, a pause between the storm and the sunrise. Word of the legal filings spread faster than wildfire. Whispers turned into speculation, and speculation into headlines. Businessman's wife withdraws claim amid investigation. Family empire under audit. Old wealth, new scandal. Reporters circled the gate like vultures. The phones never stopped ringing. Everyone wanted to know what had really happened, but the truth was quieter and far less glamorous than they imagined. Inside, my father was rebuilding not just his estate, but himself. The study that had once been filled with deceit was now alive with movement again. Files lined the desk, ledgers were open, and for the first time in years, he was working not for expansion but for redemption. He began visiting each property personally, farms, offices, rental units, the old textile mill. He greeted workers by name, shook hands, listened. He was no longer the distant figure sitting behind tinted glass. He was a man returning to his roots, walking through the dust of his own beginnings. I accompanied him everywhere. Watching him reclaim his dignity was like watching a tree regrow after fire-scorched, scarred, but alive. Yet beneath the progress, a shadow remained. Lila's silence. No one had heard from her. Not the lawyers, not her cousin, not even the banks. Her accounts were dormant, her phone disconnected. But sometimes, at night, I could still feel her presence, like a ghost lingering at the edge of memory. The court eventually closed the case in our favor. The documents she had forged were declared void, her claims dismissed. The media feasted on the story for a while, then moved on to fresher scandals. But victory did not bring celebration. It brought reflection. My father refused to sell the mansion or the farmhouse. Let them stand, he said. One for the mistake, one for the memory. He moved back to the farmhouse soon after, leaving the city behind. The mansion was cleaned, sealed, and left under caretaker supervision. I stayed behind to oversee business operations, though the house itself had become nothing more than an echo chamber of what greed had done to us, but the peace didn't last. One morning, I received a registered letter at the office. It bore no name, just a single line on the envelope. You forgot the fire. Inside was a photograph, grainy, blurred, yet unmistakable. It was the farmhouse, taken from a distance at night. In the background, faint light glowed through the window. Someone had been there. I drove straight to the farmhouse. The road was long, lined with silence and wind. When I arrived, the gate was open. My father's car sat in the driveway, but the house was empty. In the kitchen, the stove was still warm. On the counter, a matchbox. And then I saw it, the study door ajar, a thin line of smoke curling upward. I rushed in. Papers lay scattered on the floor, some charred, others smoldering. My father sat in his chair, unmoved by the chaos. The fire had been contained, but barely. His expression was unreadable. He looked at the half-burned pile of papers and said quietly, "I was trying to destroy what she left behind." Among the ashes were fragments of her letters, documents she had once signed, photographs she had framed. The remnants of her manipulation, her words, her presence. He wasn't trying to hide them. He was trying to cleanse them. But the fire had taken more than paper. It had ignited something deeper, his guilt. That night I stayed with him. He barely spoke. The farmhouse, once a place of healing, now carried the faint scent of smoke and loss. Every flicker of the lantern cast long shadows on the walls, as if the past refused to rest. In the morning he was gone. Not far, just outside, standing near the boundary wall, staring at the horizon where the sun broke through the mist. His eyes were tired, but peaceful. He turned and said something I'll never forget. Some inherit money, others inherit mistakes. But the only inheritance that matters is what you do with both. After that day, things changed. He made me the legal executor of all estates, formalizing what he had already trusted me with. The paperwork was simple, but the meaning behind it was immense. From that point on, the empire no longer carried his name alone. It carried both of us, father and son, side by side, equal in legacy and burden. Months passed, the headlines faded. The world moved on. Until one evening, when a letter arrived, handwritten, elegant, unmistakable. It was Lila's handwriting. The message was brief. "You rebuilt it beautifully. I only ever wanted to see if you could." No address, no signature. Just that haunting line. For a long time, I stared at it, unsure whether it was arrogance or remorse. Maybe it was both. Maybe that was the only truth left of her, a woman who couldn't love without control. I didn't show the letter to my father. Some ghosts are better left unspoken. The following year, he passed away quietly in his sleep. No pain, no warning, just peace. The morning sun fell gently through the farmhouse window, lighting his face with warmth, as though forgiveness had finally found him. We buried him beside my mother, under the old neem tree near the farmhouse. The air was heavy with monsoon scent, the ground soft with rain. As the last shovel of earth fell, I realized something profound. He had died not as the man who lost everything, but as the man who rediscovered what mattered. The farmhouse became my home after that. I restored it, not to erase history but to preserve it. The letters, the photographs, even the burnt papers. They stayed, sealed in a wooden box in the study. The mansion in the city remains untouched, its windows still reflecting the sky. Sometimes I visit, walking through its silent halls, feeling the weight of everything that happened. Every time I pass the dining table, I remember that first dinner, the dry bread, the humiliation, the lesson. That moment had birthed everything that came after, the betrayal, the truth, the redemption. It was the seed of both pain and growth. And in that strange, poetic way, Layla had given us the one thing she never intended to clarity. The fire she started had burned away the illusion. What remained was real. After the funeral, the days settled into a strange stillness. The farmhouse breathed with routine again, doors opening to dawn light, floors creaking under the rhythm of ordinary life. Yet every sound felt doubled, as though memory itself walked beside me. The world expected closure, but grief doesn't obey time. It lingers like humidity after rain, unseen but everywhere. My father's absence reshaped everything. Even the walls seemed to listen differently. The air carried a new weight, not heavy with sadness, but with responsibility. I spent most mornings in the study he had reclaimed. His handwriting still filled the margins of notebooks, neat and deliberate, thoughts half finished as if he had planned to return to them. The ledger lay open on the desk, a bookmark still tucked between 2 pages. Legacy doesn't end, it changes hands. I took that as instruction. The months that followed became an exercise in rebuilding without illusion. I closed dormant accounts, re-registered properties, restructured trusts. The family name began to recover in quiet ways. Old business partners returned, cautious but respectful. The newspapers moved on to newer scandals. The silence that followed success felt almost unnatural. But peace, I learned, has an echo, and mine carried her name. It began subtly. A phone call with no voice, a letter with no sender. Documents reordered on the desk after I locked the study. At first, I blamed exhaustion. Then, one afternoon, the caretaker mentioned a woman visiting the outer fields at dusk, tall, veiled, carrying Lily. When asked who she was, she only said, "Someone paying a debt." The caretaker thought nothing of it. I did. That evening, I drove to the fields. The soil was freshly disturbed near the old neem tree where my parents rested. Someone had placed white lily at its base, no note, no name, just flowers. The gesture was too deliberate to ignore. Over the following week, similar traces appeared, a perfume faintly familiar in the corridor, a new candle in the kitchen, an envelope left on the veranda containing nothing but an old family photograph. Each sign gentle, almost apologetic, yet haunting in its precision. It felt like she was still orchestrating something, not destruction this time, but remembrance on her terms. One night, unable to rest, I walked through the farmhouse with a lantern. The rain had started again, tapping against the windows. In the flicker of light, every shadow seemed alive. I stepped outside the study and pushed the door open. The scent hit me first, her perfume, faint but undeniable. On the desk lay a single sheet of paper. No signature, only a sentence in familiar handwriting. "Fire purifies, but ashes remember." I stood frozen, the lantern trembling slightly in my hand. She was alive, watching, maybe even close. But more than fear, I felt an odd calm. The woman who had once tried to own everything now existed only as a whisper in the corners of her own ruin. Still, I couldn't let it linger. The past has a way of infecting the present if left unattended. I decided to finish what my father had started, to document everything. For weeks, I compiled a detailed record of every transaction, every deceit, every recovery. I wrote it not as accusation, but as testimony. A story of the house that burned twice. It was part confession, part inheritance, a warning for whoever came after. While sorting through old archives, I uncovered something unexpected. Hidden within a property file labeled South Estate No. 7 was an unsigned deed, land purchased under a holding company registered years before my father met Layla, the owner's name. Amina Dar Trust. Amina Dar, my mother's maiden name. It wasn't her writing. It wasn't his. It was hers. The realization hit like cold water. Layla had bought property using my mother's name years earlier, quietly, perhaps to secure leverage, long before she married my father. The land itself lay far from the city, near the industrial edge where development had stalled. No one had mentioned it since. Why had she hidden it? I decided to see for myself. The next morning before sunrise, I drove out. The highway stretched endless and empty, the air thick with the smell of wet soil. When I reached the coordinates, I found nothing but an abandoned warehouse and an overgrown lot surrounded by rusted fencing. But at the center stood a small structure, a single-room cottage, made of stone and iron, windowless except for one narrow slit near the roof. Inside, dust lay thick as fabric. The air was cold and stale. And in the middle of the floor, beneath a layer of debris, was a sealed metal box. It took effort to open, the hinges resisting like secrets. Inside were documents wrapped in plastic, a ledger, a few letters, and an envelope marked with my father's initials. The ledger detailed money transfers dating back nearly a decade before their marriage. Transactions disguised as charitable donations funneled into her name. She had been planning her empire long before she ever entered our home. But the envelope stopped me. Inside was a single photograph, my father, younger, standing beside a woman who wasn't my mother, wasn't Layla, but someone I didn't recognize. On the back, a single date and a name. For what we promised. It made no sense at first, until I compared handwriting. The caption was hers. Lila's. The story I thought I knew began to warp. She hadn't just arrived to exploit wealth. She had known my father from before. Perhaps in business, perhaps in something deeper. She wasn't an intruder, she was a ghost from a forgotten chapter of his own making. I sat there for a long time, the storm rumbling outside, the narrative of victim and villain suddenly blurred. The truth was no longer clean. Back at the farmhouse, I placed the ledger and photograph beside my father's letters. I didn't try to decode them further. Some truths don't belong to the living. That night, I burned a single candle in the study. The wind outside howled against the windows, but inside, the air felt still, almost forgiving. The flames flickered across the walls, illuminating portraits, books, and the empty chair where my father once sat, and for the first time I didn't feel haunted. The echoes were no longer hers, they were mine. The weight of inheritance had shifted again, from property to understanding. By morning, the lily at the grave were gone. The caretaker said the wind had blown them away, but I knew better. She had come one last time, not to reclaim, not to destroy, but to close the circle. The empire she tried to own had survived her. The love she tried to counterfeit had found its way back to authenticity. The farmhouse stood quiet, once more rebuilt, forgiven, alive. Autumn came softly that year. The fields around the farmhouse turned gold, the air carried the dry scent of fading crops, and the evenings grew cooler, quieter. It was the kind of stillness that invites reflection, the kind that makes you count what remains after all the noise is gone. Months had passed since the discovery of that warehouse and the photograph inside it, yet its presence lingered in my thoughts like a half-remembered song. My father's handwriting, my mother's letters, Lila's secrets, they had become pieces of a single vast puzzle. But for the first time, I didn't feel compelled to solve it. I simply wanted to preserve it. That was when the idea of the Testament of Ashes began. It wasn't meant to be a legal document or a memoir for the press. It was something more personal, a story that tied every thread together, not to justify but to record. I wanted to write about everything as it truly happened, the humiliation of dry bread, the hollow glory of wealth, the slow corrosion of trust, and the strange redemption that followed. I wrote at night when the house was quiet. The lamp cast a warm circle of light across the desk, and outside, the fields whispered with the wind. Each page became a confession, some painful, others peaceful. There was no anger left in the ink, only understanding. In those writings, I found clarity. My father had been proud, flawed, human. Lila had been cunning, lonely, and perhaps far more broken than she ever showed. And one, through all of it, had learned that family is not a structure, it's a choice renewed daily, through honesty and endurance. I began to organize my father's files into a single chest: ledgers, letters, deeds, and a copy of my own testament. On the inside of the chest lid, I wrote a single line: "Truth needs no witness when it is written in fire." The farmhouse became my sanctuary. Days slipped by in quiet routine. I managed the estates from afar, spoke to workers, oversaw the farms, repaired what decay had touched. The house itself seemed to heal with me. Cracks in the walls filled, weeds in the garden thinned, light found its way into rooms that had been closed for years. Until one evening in late November, when the caretaker brought me a parcel. No sender's name, only a wax seal, faded but unmistakable. The same golden emblem Layla had used years ago. My hands hesitated before opening it. Inside was a thin folder, containing one letter and a small ornate key. The letter was dated 2 weeks before my father's death. "To whoever finds this," it began, "know that my story was never meant to end in ownership or exile. I built walls out of fear and called them safety. Your father once promised me forgiveness I could not accept. Perhaps you can." She had written about the farmhouse, how it reminded her of a version of him she had known long before the wealth, when he was still a dreamer, still searching for meaning. The letter ended with a direction. Under the old oak behind the east fence, use the key. I waited until morning. The sky was pale and cold, the earth damp from night dew. Behind the fence stood the oak massive, silent, eternal. Beneath its roots, the soil looked disturbed. I dug carefully. The shovel struck something metallic. A small chest emerged, rusted but intact. The key fit perfectly. Inside were objects wrapped in linen. An old diary, a single photograph, and a folded document. The diary belonged to Layla. Her handwriting, once precise and cold, felt softer here, hesitant, almost human. She had written about loneliness, about feeling unseen, about wanting to be part of something that was already whole without her. She wrote about loving a man who never truly let her in, and resenting him for the love he still carried for another woman, my mother. Then, near the end, she wrote, I never wanted his empire. I wanted his peace. The photograph was older still, my father and Layla sitting beside the half-built mansion, both smiling genuinely. Before the masks, before the manipulation, there had been affection. Maybe even hope. The document was a transfer, legal, witnessed, legitimate. It assigned the warehouse property and 2 smaller estates to my name. It had been signed months before the chaos began. Her signature, not forged, sat clear at the bottom. I stood there for a long time, the chest open at my feet, the morning light slanting through the trees. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. It was something quieter, a gesture of closure, long delayed. Back inside the farmhouse, I placed the chest beside my father's letters. For years, I had seen Layla only as the villain of our story. But standing there, surrounded by the remnants of her truth, I realized she was more than that. She was a mirror showing us what greed does, what love can't fix, what silence can destroy. That night, I added one final page to the Testament of Ashes. Every fire begins with a spark. But what defines it is not what it burns, but what it leaves behind. This house, this family, these scars, they are not curses. They are proof that we lived fully, dangerously, truthfully. Even betrayal, when remembered honestly, becomes inheritance. I sealed the manuscript and locked it inside the chest with the rest. It wasn't meant for the world. It was meant for whoever came next to know the cost of pride and the weight of love disguised as power. Days passed quietly after that. The sky grew colder, the nights longer. The farmhouse slept under the comfort of routine. But every now and then, when I walked past the old oak, I could still feel her presence, a faint echo, neither haunting nor hostile, just a reminder. The fire had finally burned itself out. All that remained was truth. Winter arrived without ceremony. A pale mist rolled over the fields each morning, softening the outlines of the farmhouse until it looked half-imagined, something between memory and dream. I had grown used to that quiet. It was the sound of a life rebuilt. I no longer measured time in court dates or property valuations. The rhythm of my days came from smaller things, the creak of the barn door, the whistle of the kettle, the distant laughter of workers harvesting sugarcane at the edge of the land. What remained of the estate no longer felt like an empire. It felt human. The world beyond our fences had moved on. Newspapers that once printed our scandal now lined shop windows to keep out the wind. In town, people nodded politely, curious but respectful. I had become the young master-turned-farmer, a story they told their children about wealth finding humility. But the truth was simpler. I was still learning how to live without performance. The return of purpose. When the harvest ended that first winter, I used part of the profits to reopen the old village school my father once funded in his youth. The building had been abandoned for years. The roof sagged, and the desks were brittle with age. Yet the walls still carried traces of chalk drawings and children's laughter, faded but persistent. We repaired it slowly, plank by plank. The villagers offered help, carpenters, masons, even the women who brought food during long workdays. It wasn't charity, it was shared restoration. In their eyes, I saw the reflection of something my family had forgotten: belonging. By spring, the school reopened. Dozens of children arrived barefoot, faces bright, hands clutching new notebooks. I stood beneath the same neem tree where my father once gave his first donation speech, but I said nothing this time. Words had built too many false monuments. Silence, I realized, could sometimes speak louder than promises. The city's shadow, though the farmhouse had become my world, the city never fully released its grip. Letters arrived weekly from corporate offices, investment boards, and journalists still fascinated by our rise and fall saga. I ignored most of them until one arrived bearing a familiar signature, the head of the charitable foundation my mother once chaired. They wanted to convert one of our unused city warehouses into a community shelter. The same warehouse Layla had once hidden under my mother's name. The irony wasn't lost on me. That property had been born of deceit. Perhaps redemption could begin there. I visited quietly, watching as life re-entered what had once been a vault of secrets. It felt like setting a ghost free. The weight of memory. Back at the farmhouse, winter faded into early spring. The days lengthened, the light grew softer. One spent evenings on the veranda, rereading the Testament of Ashes. Every page reminded me how far we had come from that night of humiliation, the dry bread that had begun everything. The table from that evening still stood in the mansion, covered now with a white sheet. Sometimes I thought about removing it, burning it, ending the symbol once and for all. But then I realized destruction was no longer necessary. The table's existence didn't haunt me. It educated me. It reminded me that pride, when left unchecked, always feeds on those closest to it. The visit one afternoon, as clouds gathered and wind stirred the fields, a visitor arrived. She was elderly, frail, and carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to pain. Her name was Samira, Layla's older sister. She had come not for money or explanation but for remembrance. She told me Layla had died months earlier, quietly in a small coastal town. No scandal, no fortune, just a rented room filled with her books and a single painting of the farmhouse hanging on the wall. Samira handed me a sealed envelope. "She wanted you to have this," she said, her voice breaking. After she left, I sat beneath the window's soft light and opened it. Inside were 2 pages. The first was a list of charitable donations made in the last months of her life, small amounts, scattered across orphanages and shelters, many under false names. The second page was shorter, written in her slanted hand. If love is a kind of ownership, I was never meant to hold it. I only knew how to buy what I feared to lose. Burn this, or keep it, but understand me, if only a little. I didn't burn it. I placed it inside the chest beside my father's letters. They belonged together, 2 halves of a story that had finally met in humility. A new foundation. By summer, the estate's accounts were balanced, the debts cleared, the trust stable. The mansion remained closed, but I decided to convert part of the farmland into a foundation, an initiative that offered housing and education for families displaced by failed businesses. We called it the Family House Project. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but the name felt right. What began as an empire of appearances would end as a haven of purpose. On Inauguration Day, the villagers gathered under banners made from old bed sheets. Children sang, elders clapped, and someone handed me a loaf of fresh bread wrapped in cloth. I smiled at the gesture, simple and honest. It felt like the universe's quiet way of closing the circle. The quiet air, as dusk settled, I walked back to the farmhouse alone. The air smelled of earth and smoke from distant fires used to burn crop residue. In the horizon, the city lights shimmered F5 faintly, but they no longer called to me. I realized then that legacy isn't about who owns the last word, it's about who keeps the world alive after the words fade. My father had built wealth. Layla had tested it. I had turned it back into meaning. In the study, I opened the chest one last time. Inside lay the full archive of our lives, documents, photographs, the testament, her letters, his will. I added one more item, a new photograph of the reopened school, its walls bright, its courtyard filled with children. Then I locked the chest and sealed it with wax, not as an ending, as preservation. Outside, the stars were clear. The neem tree swayed in slow rhythm with the night breeze. For the first time in years, I felt light, not victorious, not resigned, just complete. The air of silence had finally learned how to make peace speak. The year the rains came early, the earth around the farmhouse turned the color of bronze. Water pooled in the furrows of the sugarcane rows, frogs sang from the ditches, and every night the air carried the scent of new life. It was the same season, almost to the day, when everything had first fallen apart years ago. Now it felt like the world has circled back only to show me what endurance looks like when it stops needing witnesses. Inside, the house had grown quieter but not lonely. The clock in the hall still ticked. The beams still groaned when the wind shifted. The silence had become a heartbeat. I spent my mornings writing letters for the foundation, my afternoons walking the perimeter walls, and my evenings sitting by the veranda with tea, watching dusk blur into darkness. Time has stopped asking for explanations. It only asked to be noticed. The generation to come. Children from the school visited often. They brought drawings of the farmhouse bright, uneven sketches full of color where I had once seen only shadow. They called me uncle, not sir. That small word carried more respect than all the titles our family once guarded. One of them, a boy named Ayan, reminded me of myself. Observant, quiet, always questioning. He asked once if the house had ghosts. I told him every house does, but only the ones that loved us enough to stay. He nodded seriously and ran off laughing. Watching him play in the courtyard, I realized how far the story had traveled, from arrogance to humility, from power to stewardship. This was the real inheritance, the one that couldn't be stolen by signatures or forged wills. It lived in laughter, in use, in continuity. The sealed room one afternoon, while replacing roof tiles before the next storm, I noticed a small crack in the western wall of the attic. Behind it was a hollow space barely large enough to hold a box. Dust poured out as I widened it. Inside was a wooden case wrapped in oilcloth. The handwriting on its tag was unmistakably my father's. For when the house grows quiet again. Inside lay a few pages of his final notes. He had written them sometime after moving back to the farmhouse during the brief months of calm before his passing. His words were steady, deliberate. If you are reading this, then the noise has faded and only truth remains. Do not waste it. Houses remember the hands that built them, not the arguments that filled them. When your own hands grow old, leave them open. Let others build. There was also a small envelope containing a key, the twin of the one Layla had left. On its ribbon was a line in my mother's handwriting, faint but legible. For peace, no explanation, no instructions, just faith that I would understand. The letter to the future. That night, I added one final section to the Testament of Ashes. I wrote not about wealth or deceit or survival, but about the act of remembering. Every family writes its story in two kinds of ink, what is said aloud and what is carried in silence. When the ink fades, the silence remains, shaping what comes next. If one day you inherit this house, read not what we wrote, but how we lived after we fell. I sealed the manuscript again and placed it inside the attic chest beside my father's note. The twin keys, his and Layla's, I tied together and left on top. Together they no longer symbolized division, they formed a single closure. The last visit to the mansion before the monsoon reached full strength, I returned to the city mansion one final time. Dust covered the marble, vines crept through cracks in the courtyard, and silence hung where music once played. The dining room table still stood at the center, draped in its white sheet. I pulled the cloth away. The wood beneath was smooth, untouched, as if waiting. I placed a loaf of fresh bread on its soft, warm, alive, and beside it a simple note, for the family that learned. Then I locked the doors and left them to time. The mansion would remain closed, a monument not to wealth, but to transformation. The farewell of rain. When I returned to the farmhouse, thunder rolled across the sky. The first heavy drops struck the roof with the same rhythm the dry bread once hit my plate, sharp, deliberate, unforgettable. Only now it no longer felt like insult. It felt like applause. The rain poured for hours, flooding the fields, washing dust from the walls. I stood under the veranda watching it, the key still cold in my hand. In that sound, the endless drumming of renewal, I finally heard what my father and Layla and even my younger self had been chasing all along. The simple, unpretentious proof that life goes on. The final inheritance. Years will pass before someone else finds the chest, the letters, the records of our imperfect redemption. They will read of greed and forgiveness, of signatures and silence, of a house that burned but refused to fall. They will know that inheritance is not marble or money. It is the courage to rebuild when everything looks ash. As the rain eased and night deepened, I closed the farmhouse doors, the sound of dripping water echoing through the halls. The air smelled of earth and bread and smoke, a mixture of endings and beginnings. Somewhere beyond the fields, a train passed, its whistle fading into distance like the closing line of a long story. I whispered into the quiet, "It's done." And for the first time in a lifetime, the house did not answer with an echo. It simply breathed alive, content, and whole.